Hello, viewers and listeners. This is Stu, your co-host, and I'm here with Patty, the paranormalist. Patty, how are you today?
I am fine despite the cold weather and what all is going on
hmm
in the world. We're good.
All right, good to hear. So, what do you have for us today?
So I don't know. I've been lately feeling like I needed to do some ghost stories, but not just the average ghost story. I wanted to talk about ghosts that came back because they had a purpose, something they needed to do.
Hmm.
And there are some really interesting stories of that. I found one honestly 25 years ago that is probably still, I actually wrote about it in my very first book, which would put me back 1999.
Oh, the green one.
Yes, the green one. And it's a story that's always stuck with me because it's such a poignant story. And I thought we'll start with it and we'll go work our way through there. Because they're not all the stories are the same. There's some stories that are about rescuing other people, some about solving their own murders, all kinds of different reasons why they came back. But they came back, and in some very interesting ways, including one case where they literally allowed the testimony in court.
Wow. Hmm.
And there are a few cases like that in American Jewish jurisprudence and a couple in England that I know of. But let's start with the first one. So the first story is actually called The Girl in the Red Shawl.
Okay.
And the story took place in Philadelphia in about 1880. It is documented by a Dr. Silas Michael, or excuse me, Dr. Cyrus Weir Mitchell. So Dr. Mitchell. So
Yep.
Dr. Mitchell was a doctor living in Philadelphia in the 1880s. It was the middle of the winter. He and his wife were sitting there one evening. It was in a cold, snowy, miserable kind of night that we get, in Pennsylvania. And he was thinking, he was kind of glad nobody needed doctor services. And that's when they kind of heard this noise. It almost sounded like something clacking in the wind outside at first, and then he realized it was his front door. That doesn't bode well for a doctor in that time period because patients came and found you at your home. So he sort of sighed, and his wife said, "Let him knock. It's too cold to go out. It's too slippery." He said, "No, I better not." So he goes over and he opens the door, and in the shadows from the inside of the house, he can just barely make out this little girl about 10 years old. And she's in a thin little dress, a little red shawl wrapped around her. And she says, "Dr. Mitchell, you need to follow me. My mommy's really sick." And he was going to ask her questions, but she turns and starts down the steps. He doesn't know what to do. This child should not be out there alone in the cold, in the dark. So he grabs his hat and his coat and he says, "I'll be back." And he takes off with his doctor's bag and his stuff. And he follows her. And he says in his journal entries that she was like a little will-o'-the-wisp. He would lose her in the blowing snow, and suddenly she would be back at his side, pulling on his coat or taking his hand and going, "This way, doctor, hurry, this way." And her hands were as cold as ice, but she had no gloves, nothing. He just assumed it was the cold. And she led him eventually to a tenement building, and there were no lights, there was no activity. It looked like it was abandoned. And he said, "You couldn't possibly live here." And she said, "Hurry, doctor, my mom's inside." And he followed her inside the building and up the rickety steps to one of the upper floors. She went into this room, into this apartment, and the whole place was just a frozen, empty building.
Hmm.
And he opens the door. She had opened the door and gone in this room, and he opens the door and goes in behind her, and laying on the floor was a pile of rags, or what he took as a pile of rags. And what it was this woman on a dirty mat, and she was covered in dirty, ragged pieces of cloth to keep her warm. He found a candle and he lit it. There was no heat in the room at all. It had to be, almost zero out. It was bitter cold. And he kind of did a cursory look around the room for the little girl, and she's not there. But his focus becomes the woman on the mat that's laying there, and he goes over to her. He ascertains that she's barely alive, but she is alive. And he turns her over, and to his shock, he recognizes her. She had once been a maid at their home, and he had never known what happened to her, but about 10, 12 years ago, she had been one of his maids. And he called her by name, and she looked up and she opened her eyes and she said, "Doctor, how did you get here?" And he said, "Because you have a very brave little girl." And he scrummages around and he finds some wood, and he makes a fire in the fireplace in the room she's in, and pulls her closer to the fire and starts working on her to get her thawed out and what have you. And she was literally freezing to death. Well, after a little while, the room begins to get a little warm, and he makes her a cup of hot water, basically, because that's all she had.
Mhm.
But it's warm, and he's like, "You need to drink this." So he gets her to drink in this, and they start to talk a little bit. And he said, "I don't know where your child is, but she didn't have on decent clothing. She should be in here where it's warm." And the woman begins to cry, and she says, "What are you talking about?" And he says, "Your little girl." And she said, "My little girl's dead. She died about 5 months ago." And he said, "No, no, no. Little girl, 10 years old, dark hair. I followed her through the storm. She pounded on my door." And she's like, "No, no. All I have left of my daughter's in that little closet." And he went over and he opened the door with his candle in hand. And in there was this little dress that he had seen the little girl in, and the little red shawl, and they were strung over a hanger. And he reached out and touched them, and they were both wet, as though she had been in them, wearing them through the storm.
Hmm.
And he turned back to her and he said, "Truly, you have been saved by a miracle from your child." And he would later write about this event. He had the woman gathered up and brought to a doctor's office, or a place where she could recuperate, and he took care of her and what have you. But it never left him that little child that appeared at his door, and then would appear through the snow and take his hand and say, "This way, doctor, hurry, hurry,"
Mhm.
as though she knew she had to save her mother's life.
That's a nice story too, and not just a physical not an apparition that you can just see, but physical, to be able to knock on a door, to be able to tug and pull.
Yeah,
That's extraordinary. Yeah.
he never questioned her reality until
Mhm.
the woman kept saying, "My daughter's dead." And I just find that to be an amazing story. And it's not by any stretch of the imagination the only one. I would like to tell another story. There's a story that actually made it to Unsolved Mysteries, and it's very famous, but it's not been told in a long, long time. So this would have been there was a woman by the name of Deborah Hoyt. Her and her husband were away from home and staying at some friend's home, and they were going to leave the next day and drive home in the daylight because it was just but much easier drive. They had to cross a couple little mountains out in California, and where they were staying and what have you, to get back to their home. And her husband told her that they would leave that next afternoon, and they would do the whole drive in the daylight. Well, in the middle of the night, she woke up, Deborah Hoyt, and she is absolutely in a turmoil. "We've got to go. We've got to go now." And he's like, "We can't leave in the middle of the night and leave our friends and just be rude." And she's like, "No, no, no. There's something wrong. There's something wrong. We have to go now. I have this horrible feeling that it'll be too late in the morning. We got to go now." Well, eventually, she is so persuasive. He gets up, he goes and knocks on the bedroom door of his friends, and he says, "Look, we're having a family emergency. So we're going to have to leave now." And he said, "I'll explain it all later." He didn't know what the answer was. She didn't know what the answer was. So they're driving along. It's the middle of the night now, like 2 o'clock in the morning. And they are in this remote area going up over this mountain. There's really nothing for miles around them. And as they're driving by, she's being very quiet. He's focusing on the road. He's exhausted. He's probably a little bit peeved because she can't give him a reason. And she's just watching out the side window intently. And all of a sudden she yells, "There it was. Did you see it? I think it was a naked woman on the side of the road." And he's like, "What?" She's like, "There's a naked woman on the side of the road. We need to go back." And he's like, "No, we're not going back. Somebody's setting you up. if we go back, there's gonna be guys there and they're gonna carjack us or something. So instead of going backward, what he says to her is, we're not too far from a little town. We'll find a payphone there. This is before cell phones. Those have been like 1994. And they go into this little town down at the bottom of the mountain. They find a payphone. They call the police and they say there's a dead woman or an unconscious woman on the side of the road up on the mountain on Route 50. And the police say, okay, great. We want you to stay where you're at. We'll meet you there. We'll follow you up. You can show us where you're talking about. Because it's really heavily filled with vegetation and there are no houses. So, it's going to be a rough place to find a spot if they try to describe it. What are you going to say? There's trees.
Right.
So they said, okay. They met them and the police followed them up the mountain. Nothing. They couldn't find a single solitary thing. And they drove back and forth multiple times. There was no naked lady on the road. And her husband's now about 2/3 convinced that maybe this was a setup. And the police are like, we don't know what's going on. Maybe it was a setup. So they tell the family the couple just go home. Well, of course, it doesn't take long for this story to make its way through the police station. And the next day, a police officer who works at the same station comes in and he hears about this weird, mysterious phone call about the naked girl on the mountain. And it was on Route 50. And he had taken a phone call a few days earlier from a very upset couple, older couple, who were looking for their daughter, Christine Skubish, and their little grandson. And their daughter had moved from the Midwest, where she was from, to out to California to take a job and to start her whole life over. And she had with her like 4-year-old little her 4-year-old little son. And every night on the journey, she would call home and tell her folks, I made it to this point now, and we're fine, and they would talk a little bit, and then it would be she'd put her little son to bed, and they just were doing this journey in these little circuits. And she had quit calling about 4 days earlier. And now the family was very worried because that's not like her. She's not that kind of person. She never missed a night of phone call, even if she had to call super, super late. She would at least call them and say, hey, we got to a motel, we're safe. I'll call you in the morning before we take off. I'm really beat. So they had been hunting for her and couldn't find her, had called the local police because they knew the last place she had talked to them was before she entered those mountains. She had stayed at a little motel the night before, and then she had said about how she was not feeling well and she was tired and she should probably rest, but she wanted to get through those mountains because that was a really rough journey. So she had told them that's where she was headed. So they knew that somewhere on Route 50 is the last time her car was seen. Well, this cop just kind of feels, I don't know, obliged, if you will. So he starts driving up and down the road on Route 50 on this section of highway, and he can't see anything. So finally, just because he feels almost haunted by this whole thing, he can't let it go. He gets out of his squad car and he starts to walk. And it's in the area where the other officers had told him they had seen the body of the naked woman. And as he's walking along, he sees this little break in the trees that looks like maybe something went through there. And he goes over to the edge and he realizes there's an embankment and he can just barely make out the glint of some metal. And he thinks, oh my God, that's a car. That's a car. And he goes back and he calls for assistance. He's like, there's a car, it's down over this embankment, it's way far down. And then he tries to get down there because he knows there's a woman and a little boy that's missing. This little boy's name is Nick, by the way, Nikki, and the grandparents kept saying that we can't find her and Nikki. And He gets down there, and mom is strapped in the car, fully clothed and dead. And Nikki is balled up in a ball beside her on the driver's, on the front seat beside the driver, and he's unconscious. So he runs back up over the hill and he says, "We need an ambulance. We need an ambulance now, now." And very quickly, the ambulance and everything gets there. He leads them down and they take the little boy out. He's extremely dehydrated. He's been 4 days without fluids. And they check on the mom. The mom died on impact, is how it looks. The coroner will later subsequently also confirm the mom died on impact. And yet when the couple had been told about what had happened, and Deborah saw a picture of Christine, she identifies her as the naked woman on the ground. So the question is, what happened? How did this go about? Is it possible that Christine, her spirit, because she was still strapped into the car and she was still fully clothed in the car, her spirit made it to the top of the road to try to get help, and she's the one who gave Deborah that feeling of, we got to get up and go now, now, now. It's going to be too late tomorrow. And it would have been, the little boy would have been dead. The doctors would later tell the police officer that had they been an hour or two more, he would have died from the dehydration. And so I've always found this story to be such an amazing story. It's heart-wrenching. It really is.
Sure.
That she passed away. She loved her son so much. She passed away, and from the dead reached out to try to save his life, and did. She succeeded. He would be raised by her parents, and he said the only thing he remembered as a little boy was he remembers the crash because it was scary, and then his mommy didn't talk anymore.
Oh.
Now he's a full-grown man. And what an amazing story of how much she loved him.
That's unusual though, because at least this is the first time I've ever heard of a naked ghost.
There's an old chestnut in the paranormal community about, okay, so spirits can manifest, but they almost always manifest clothed. There's a couple stories about naked ghosts, but I don't know why she chose that or if she didn't choose it, but yeah, it's unusual. There's only a couple other stories I know of where the ghosts appeared naked.
Weird. But that's, in the end, she did save her son though, so that's, yeah, maybe she was just looking for some, I'm going to get more attention this way.
And that's possible.
Yeah.
That is possible.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very appealing, poignant way to find her body, so that's what motivated them to call the police, and they needed, help, and she needed help to save her son. So maybe she chose the most dramatic way she could manifest for his sake, hoping that this would be enough to move people to help her. And I guess if that's the case, it worked. It's a fascinating and amazing story, and not well known anymore.
I'm not familiar with Route 50 in California. I was in the Air Force. I was stationed in California, and I was familiar with Route 80, Route 20.
Yeah.
But not 50. Yeah.
That's the newspaper articles and stuff always identified it as Route 50. So I'm assuming that's accurate. So I know it's a fascinating, isn't it?
It is. So you have more in the same vein?
Well, I have more, not all in the same. These were the ones who saved other people or what have you. I'll talk about a couple other stories where people solved their own murders. So there was a woman by the name of Teresita Basa, who was a nurse, and she came from the Philippines, and she was found dead in her apartment on February the 21st of 1979. I remember the February 21st because it was my father's birthday. And when the police found her body, there had been a smoldering fire in the house. It basically looked like somebody had drug a mattress into the room, put her body on top of it, piled some stuff on top of that was flammable, lit it, and then left, thinking the fire would hide what happened. But it didn't. It burnt, smoldered a while, burned off the paper and crap that he had thrown over the top of the body, and left pretty much everything there. So they still had the body. Now, she was a really nice girl. She was, like I said, a nurse at one of the local hospitals. She didn't have anything in her history or her background to explain why somebody would come into her home and murder her. And the home wasn't broken into. The police ascertained that much. Whoever it was, she let them through the door. So it had to be somebody who knew her.
Okay.
And her television, for some odd reason, was sitting not on the television stand, but on the floor, in the middle of the floor. And just things were moved out of place in odd ways. And then her bedroom was looted. It was flipped, and everything was missing out of there, like jewelry and what have you. So, the ladies, the people at the hospital, all were just devastated. She had some other friends. She had a friend. One of them was a doctor by the name of Ramy Chua, who was also from the Philippines. And this woman, Ramy, and her husband were both doctors at the same hospital, had known Teresita very well. And because they came from the same area, they had a deep friendship. They had a lot to talk about. So the police are starting to look around, trying to figure out, and they've now ascertained not only was she robbed, but she was raped before she was killed. And they're looking everywhere. So they're looking at her work. Who did she know from work? Who did she hang out with? Did anybody know if she had a boyfriend? And all of this. And on one of the visits to the hospital, the police start talking to this Remy Chua, and she breaks down in tears and she says, "I shouldn't tell you this. I shouldn't tell you this." And then proceeds to tell them that at night, Teresita's ghost was visiting her and telling her what had happened. And she began to explain what these nightmares look like. She said that there was a man's face in the dreams, that Teresita would stand there, and behind her there would be a man's face. It was this gentleman was a black man, and she said, "I don't know him, but he looks almost familiar." And she actually at one point had been so upset. She had fallen asleep one day at work in like the doctor's lounge, and when her husband woke her up, it wasn't her talking, it was Teresita's voice coming through. And she was telling him, "You need to help her to get me help. You need to. And he was like, "You need to get out of my wife." He was really freaked out by what was going on. Eventually, she did leave, and Chua came back to herself, and she told the police officer that she told all of this to. She said, "Man stole her jewelry, and there was this really pretty green pin," and she described it. It was made of jade, and it had a distinctive, very distinctive look and clasp. They would later subsequently learn from Teresita's family, that this pin was a family heirloom, and that one was made for each of the daughters. And so they knew exactly what it would look like, because pictures were sent to them of this pin, because her sister had one as well. And eventually the nightmares become such that the woman, the doctor recognizes the man. He's an intern or an orderly at the same hospital. Like, she literally came face to face with him one day and thought, "Oh my God, this is the man from the dream." So she called the police, and she told the police, and the police begin to interview him. And he's like, "Well, they're going to take your fingerprints and all this is going to happen." He's like, "Well, hey, my fingerprints are going to be in Teresita's house because I volunteered to help her fix her TV." after work one day, she was saying her TV was broken. I said, oh, I can fix that. And he's like, so it'll be there anyway. So he had kind of covered his story so that if they found his fingerprints, it was good. It was the jewelry that would end up being the thing. So they went to talk to not just him, but to his girlfriend. And while they were talking to the girlfriend, she had that little piece of jade jewelry on, and they said, well, that's a very pretty, piece of jewelry. And she said, oh, my boyfriend gave it to me. Isn't it amazing? I've never seen anything like it. And they're like, really? Yeah, well, we have once before.
Yeah.
And then they took the jewelry. They said that came from our murder victim, and they took the jewelry in and they interviewed the gentleman again. And when they confronted him with the jewelry and said, we can prove to you that this belonged to Teresita, that she would not have left it for any reason, and you stole it when you murdered her, he confessed and ended up being convicted of her murder. But she did not stop the dreams until such time as she was able to give enough information to document the case so that she could find justice.
The movie Ghost and Patrick Swayze. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I have to tell you, this has happened multiple times. There's a case from Greenbrier, West Virginia. Hester Shue was the young lady's name. She was married to a gentleman who her mother didn't like, and he was kind of a ne'er-do-well. He wasn't a really good husband, and he wasted his money, and he just wasn't a very good person at all. He did not treat his wife very well. And one day he went to the druggist, and this would have been in like the 1880s, I believe it is, 1880 or 1890s, 90s maybe, yeah, 1897. And anyway, he went to the druggist, and he said to them, hey, can you send the boy over with a little pouch of the headache powders, because my wife is sick and I got to go to work. So he paid for it, and he sent the 14-year-old boy over there that worked for the druggist who did deliveries. And the boy came into the house, knocked on the door. The door was unlocked. He opened the door to call out to let her know that he had her medicine. She didn't answer, and it was just deathly quiet in the house. But he did step in a couple seconds, and he yelled again, hey, I have your medicine. And he walked into the kitchen, and from the kitchen he could see into the next room, and she was laying on the floor dead. So he summoned the police. They determined, interestingly enough, she not only was dead, but that it was a suicide. And then they said, no, it was an accident. This murder got labeled everything but what it was for quite a while. So then they notify her husband, her mother, and her mother from the very beginning is convinced. She's like, no, this couldn't have been an accident. Then they said it was a robbery. It just like the police were all over the mat with this. And her husband took charge of the body. He was the next of kin. He had her dressed in this really odd scarf that was wrapped around her throat. Now, she had been seen by the coroner. She had been seen by the undertaker as the process went along. And then at the viewing, her mother says, why do you have that crazy scarf wrapped around her throat? And he's like, oh, this was her favorite scarf. And she's like, Hester didn't wear scarves. And he's like, no, I bought this for her. She was wearing it all the time. Maybe you just missed it. So he buries her, and mom's just got this horrible disquieted feeling that there's a problem. This is when things get interesting. So after several weeks, mom goes to the district attorney and says, at night, Hester comes to my room, and she stands in my room, and she tells me that her husband murdered her, that he strangled her, and she unwinds that scarf, and her neck falls to the side. She has a broken neck. And he's like, lady, the undertaker saw her, the coroner saw her. Nobody wrote down anything about a broken neck. And she's like, I'm telling you. So this went on for months. And finally, she had nagged this district attorney so much, he finally said to her, if I let you dig up your daughter and prove to you her neck's not broken, will you just go away and be quiet? And she says yes. So he sets the whole process in motion to have her exhumed. And The undertaker throws a fit, the coroner throws a fit, and if they try to slow it down, to stop the process, her husband sues them, and it still happens. And to everybody's amazement, when the scarf is unwound, she has handprints that are still bruised into her skin and a broken neck. And now the police and everybody, the district attorney, want to know what's going on. So it turns out that the undertaker and the coroner, the doctor who did the autopsy, were very good friends with her husband and had hidden this, not put any of the paperwork together that they should have. And they would eventually confess to having done this. And when the trial happened, her mother was allowed to go to court and testify that Hester appeared to her at night and told what she told her, and it was entered as testimony into the court case. And he was convicted and would eventually die in prison 8 years later. In her case, justice was served.
Already.
There's
No.
actually like roads. See how we have road signs about historical events?
Yes.
If you go down to the Greenbrier area of West Virginia, you'll find there's like a road sign that says this is the cemetery where Hester Shue is buried, blah, 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 and it tells the story. It's a well-known historical story. And I just think it's a fascinating story because it made it into court. And what are the odds that the undertaker and the good dude doing the autopsy would turn out to be his two best friends? So I'm going to tell another story, and this is about a man who decided he wanted to clear his name. This story takes place in 1913, right before the beginning of the First World War. So this gentleman's name is Desmond Arthur. He is a British Royal Flying Corps pilot, and on a routine excursion, his plane crashes in Montrose, Scotland. Now, after he dies in this plane crash, people at his air base begin to see him everywhere. They see his figure walking down hallways. He shows up in the cafeteria. They hear disembodied footsteps walking past them. And it's always the same thing. They saw him. He was in his flight gear. He literally walked through the mess hall during the day when it was filled with people. This is one of the most well-documented sightings of a ghost that could be. Now, the original verdict for the airplane crash was that it was pilot error. There was one of the flight instructors who had actually known him quite well that woke up in the middle of the night when he saw a person sitting in a chair by his bed. He rolled over to say, "Who are you and what do you want?" Realized it was Desmond, and then jumped out of bed. That he was scared to death, and then Desmond just disappeared. So because of all of the spookiness, this got a lot of attention. In fact, as I said, World War I was coming into play. When a German pilot got downed and the British caught him, he said to them, "Can you tell me what's new with that ghost at that Air Force base?" Like, they knew about it. They were following it. The Germans were following it, you know? So eventually they actually went through the process and reinvestigated the thing, and they just discovered that it was not pilot error, that it was equipment failure that killed him. And after they determined this and changed it, his name was cleared, and he made one final appearance in front of 3 of his old friends. He was smiling, and he smiled at each of them, and then he vanished, and he's never been seen since.
No more unfinished business.
No. And to put it a little closer home, there's a story about a soldier in Gettysburg who used to appear at the National Cemetery, and he would be near his grave, and he would stand there and point at the tombstone. Well, this went on for a long time. And then finally, somebody who was a history buff realized they had the wrong rank, that during the Battle of Gettysburg, he got a new rank because of what was going on. And they had given him a higher rank. And what was on the tombstone wasn't his official last rank. So he contacted the National Cemetery. They looked it up. They checked it all out. And they're like, oh, crap. Guess we were wrong. They fixed it, and he's never been seen since.
It's a stickler soldier ghost.
He wanted his rank. He earned it, man.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And there are so many great stories like this. There's this story about a guy by the name of Terry Childs who was a serial killer. And in 2017, while he's in prison for 3 people he murdered, he tells the guards, I need to talk to somebody. I have to confess I killed 2 people. And they're like, you killed 3 people. And he's like, no, I killed 2 more. I've killed 5 altogether. And they're like, okay. So they get the appropriate authorities and they interview this guy, and he confesses and he says, look, I can tell you where their bodies are, and I can tell you what happened. And sure enough, everything he says is true. Now, he didn't negotiate for a lesser term. He didn't want anything, which was puzzling, because a lot of times serial killers will try to negotiate to get better things, whether it's better accommodations in a better prison or less time or the death penalty off the table or whatever. So eventually one of the officers said to him, why did you confess to them? It's like, these were years and years earlier. This is like 1984, 1985. It's 2013. And he said, I had to, because they were eating my brain. And he's like, what do you mean they were eating your brain? He's like, they came all the time. And they would be in the cell with me. And he said, I just had this terrible sense of overwhelming guilt. They wouldn't let me alone. I've been seeing them for years and years, and I knew the only way to make it stop was to tell the truth.
And I suppose he stopped seeing them after that.
He did indeed, as a matter of fact.
Didn't mean to steal your thunder there.
Oh. Not steal it at all. It's actually,
Okay.
It's just the way the story worked. And I have one more story that I'm going to share. This is one of the weirdest stories I've ever come across. So there was this little boy from the Golan Heights in Israel, and he was 3 years old, so a very, very young child. And he comes from, and I might say this wrong, I apologize, it's not intentional, the Druze, Druze ethnic group. And he kept insisting that he had been murdered in a past life, that he was born in Syria, one of his neighbors killed him, and that he knew all of this. Well, the neighbor's name was Eli Latch, and he did not believe any of this. And he would say, oh, this kid is crazy and blah, blah, blah. This kid was loud and vocal. Like, he was telling his parents, he was telling the police, he was telling everybody. And they started looking into this dude. And people began to take this seriously. Like, what are you talking, So the kid literally confronted him in the street one day and with his parents and said, I know you murdered me when I was this other person, and I know what you did with the body, and I'm going to tell the police. This guy was the people that were around said he turned white as a ghost and just panicked. So the police listen to the kid eventually. They go to the place the kid shows them, and they find this body of this person. They go to the home of this man and arrest him. And he says, yeah, I did it. The kid's right. I murdered this guy. Now, here's the thing that's interesting. When the little boy was born, he was born with a large red birthmark across his skull that looked like a large red blade cut or something. It was very deep, and it was healed over. There was no open wound, but it was just a very deep indentation, red indentation on his skull. When the body was found, he had been killed with an axe hand, and he had been hatcheted, axe handle or axed into his head. So he had a large, long, crushed part of his skull in exactly the same spot the little boy had the birthmark.
Wow. That's extraordinary.
It's the strangest story. Like, this kid led them to the right village. They led them to the place in the village. He showed them, that's where you need to dig for my bones. He was absolutely accurate at the age of 3 on everything.
Now, what happened after justice was served?
The little boy just continued on with his life. He, to the best of my ability to tell from what I've learned, he just knows that he was murdered in a previous life. That
So
and I have a
it's,
different
Mhm.
I have
Yeah,
a
he still
different
has
take
the
on all of
recollection.
that. Yeah. And the guy confessed because he was not only confronted by the evidence, but by this little boy who gave details, really, really detailed information.
So reincarnation or just spirit imparting knowledge?
I have never been a big fan of the concept of reincarnation. I honestly believe what happens is that spirit possession happens. And people talk about possession, they always think of it as demonic, but about 90% of all of the possessions that happen are spirit possessions. The dead taking over the human body for whatever the purpose is. Sometimes it's malevolent, sometimes it's not. But honestly, I really think that that's my answer, at least to my best of my ability to tell. It fits all of the information that's available. Um, and I come from a Judeo-Christian background, so I don't believe we're living multiple lives. And I think it's as viable as the concept of reincarnation to say that there are, and I've had an experience where I've had something step into me and I know how that feels. And I know that you get their information. And there are multitudes of stories of this. There's a story I tell sometimes about a friend of mine who was sober for 25, 30 years. And he had a best friend who was an alcoholic. And his friend always drank this one cheap liquor that was purchased in this one specific bar. Like, they bought it in bulk just for him. Nobody else ever drank it. It wasn't that it was good. It was just cheap, you know?
Okay.
And it wasn't even the stuff that my friend had drank when my friend was a drinker. He didn't like it. He never had. His friend passed away, and about a week later, he said, I was on my way somewhere, and all of a sudden, I just felt like I needed to go to this bar. And it was the most intense feeling of, I need to go to this bar. So he turned the steering wheel and he ended up in this little town nearby at the bar. He gets out of the car, he locks the doors, his hands are shaking, and it's like he's jonesing for alcohol. And he gets as far as the door to the bar. He puts his hand on the door handle and he said, it was like, just like, I just knew it wasn't me. And I dropped the door handle and I stepped back and I said, and he swore, you son of a bleep. How dare you? I was always your friend, and you know how hard I fought to stay sober. Get out of me. And he said, in that moment, it was all gone. He was like, it was just like something lifted out of me, and I knew it was him looking for a drink.
Yeah, so entirely plausible with the 3-year-old boy, but to actually have the physical manifestation on his head, yeah, that goes a little bit beyond just you know
It
just
does, but
spirit possession. That's
there's a folklore. I mean, there's a folklore thing in some cultures, and actually, a lot of my family has a story. I have a story. So that if you are physically harmed, it'll show up in your children, or that things can manifest in that way. Let me explain. So my mother was the typical Scotch-Irish redhead who couldn't wait for anything. It had to be done now, yesterday. And she decided she wanted to move a bed into one of the sheds outside on our farm before I was born, while she was pregnant with me. And my dad kept saying, just wait, I'll get to it on the weekend. Well, my mother was never a person who could wait. So that was going to kill her. So one day she rolls up her sleeves and she drags this bed frame pieces down, and she's going to put them in this shed. It's the middle of July or August or something like that. And she pushes open this door to the shed that hadn't been opened in months because nobody had been in it for any reason. And when she did so, she knocked a nest of bees down on her back.
oh
okay, and it was wasps, and they stung her about 11 times in this little pattern on her back before she could get them off, and she screams and she tears her shirt off and she runs into the house. And then she can't really reach it, so she has to call my dad to come home to help her because 11 bee stings could have been, fatal. And when I was born, I had a little butterscotch mark on my hip. That was it. About a year later, I had developed a very big black birthmark that I still have to this day on my back. It has 11 pinpoints of black in it, and that are darker than the rest of the birthmark. And they're in, she said my whole life, that they are in exactly the same position where the bee stings were on her back when she was pregnant with me.
No no explanation for that other than, okay, that's
it's
paranormal.
Appalachian folk belief. I've come across it a lot in Appalachian folk remedies and folk magic and what have you. There's a strong belief of that, and I can't tell you anything other than I do have a birthmark on my back. It is really, really, really dark, and there are these 11 black pinpoints in it. Doctors have looked at it. They're like, that's the weirdest birthmark I've ever seen. And I tell them the story and they go, you're crazy. And I'm like, no, my mom is. I'm just passing it on. But it's what she always said is the explanation for this birthmark.
Well, okay then.
There's a lot of weird stuff that goes on in this world. Some of it we've poo-pooed and we've said it's all superstition and we've tucked it away, but yet you still encounter it from time to time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's the name of the show, The Paranormalist. We're looking at the paranormal, and that fits the category.
It does, but I thought this story of this little boy was just bizarre.
Yeah, how many 3-year-olds have the presence of mind that, it doesn't sound like that your typical 3-year-old.
No, I
say
mean,
things like that. Yeah.
Well, and there are stories. There's some pretty fascinating and amazing stories of children who have come forward at very young ages and said stuff like this. But this one actually managed to write somebody's murder, in that respect. So it's fascinating to me, this particular story. And that's all of the stories I have. I have like hundreds of them, but I have to stop at some point. So I will cut myself off at this level and say I hope everybody enjoyed them, because they're definitely a little bit different.
I enjoyed them. Alrighty. Well, at this point then, I think we'd like to remind our listeners and viewers that we do have an email address, paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com, and I'll make sure there's links for that in both the video and the audio description. And we'd really like to hear your ideas, your stories, your comments. We'd like feedback from you. Let us know if you like the direction of the show. Just general feedback in general. And then we also have the Facebook group. If you go into Facebook and search for the Paranormalist Podcast, that's just this show. And there's a couple others in the paranormal realm that Patty has as well. And then we also have the YouTube channel, and that's basically where the video gets published. And then every place else links to that one. And the YouTube channel is also the Paranormalist Podcast. And we'd really like it if you were to subscribe and click that like button and click the bell if you want to have notifications for new content.
Yeah, and share it out to your friends that like the paranormal, so we can, we can start building our network back again. And I have to tell you, I just heard from a lady today who was a fan of the show before and who was asking me about one of the previous episodes. And in the conversation with her, she revealed to me that she had some paranormal events happen at the same place that she had asked me about. So we're actually going to start, I'm going to hopefully incorporate her stories in an upcoming episode. So if you have stories to tell and you have things you want to share, we will keep your name confidential. If you want us to, we'll make sure we'll touch base with you. And, but we would love to share your stories. We'd love to hear from you. Maybe you can, share a podcast with us and tell your stuff. We are really wanting to hear what you have to say.
Well, on that note, we wish to thank you all, and you have a good day and a better tomorrow.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.